Welcome to the Breadwinners, the podcast about the never-ending hustle and its impact on all aspects of our lives. We're interested in what it takes to keep everything going. This podcast is about women, working, money, and family. We consider the research, talk to experts, and share our takes on what we're all learning about breadwinning. I'm Jennifer Owens. I write about working, wellness, and women, and founded the Working Mother Research Institute. And on most days, I'm joined by my co-host, Raquel Ellison. On this episode of The Breadwinners, I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Sarrett of Emory University's Center for the Study of Human Health. Her research and teaching on intellectual and developmental disabilities considers questions of ethics, justice, stigma, and health. A non-disabled ally, Jennifer also leads Disruptive Inclusion, which works with companies to consider disability and ableism as part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion equation. All of which is to say, welcome, fellow Jennifer.
Thank you so much, fellow Jennifer. I'm so happy to be here. Appreciate you having me.
You know, it is I and you and all the Jennifers that rule the world, truly.
I definitely agree with that statement. Yes.
And they should. I mean, come on, you know.
We are at the top of the pile.
Yeah. Well, so at the Breadwinners, you know, we typically start with a stat, you know, and it's kind of gives some sort of framework to what we're discussing. But I find that like the intersection of disability and breadwinning a little hard to pin down because the definitions of disability can vary. As someone who's done surveys around it where, you know, like, anyways, my whole point is anything can be considered disability. It's like, you know it in your heart, but then when you start to define it, and so I thought I'd give you the hard task of kind of defining the population we're talking about with visible and non-visible disability.
Well, yes, that is a very difficult question. You're right. It's like I tell my students with most questions, it depends.
Right.
The definition of disability is, you're right. It's kind of nebulous. It has fuzzy boundaries. And, you know, there are some disabilities that you're like, yes, definitely this belongs in the category of disability. People who use wheelchairs, sensory-based disabilities like blindness, deafness, things like that. And those are, you know, quote unquote, visible disabilities. You can kind of see them on the body and they're immediately apparent. And then there's a whole category of quote unquote, invisible disabilities or hidden disabilities, things that you can't really tell just by looking at somebody's body. These can be intellectual and developmental disabilities. They can be psychiatric disabilities. And beyond that, it kind of even gets a little bit fuzzier. There's a conversation in the disability world about who do we include under this umbrella of people with disabilities, like cancer survivors or people living with HIV/AIDS, things like that. And it really depends on your approach, what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to, if you're putting out an assertion of, look, people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the United States, which they are at 20% of the population, then you're going to kind of want to say, look, we include a whole bunch of people. But when you're thinking of particular accommodations or rights-based movements, you're going to kind of narrow it down a little bit more. And then, of course, there's medical definitions, there's legal definitions. You know, the Americans with Disabilities Act has a very specific definition that even includes women who are pregnant. It varies.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my
well, because when I did a survey at a Working Mother where we were looking at disabilities in the workplace, and you know, I got schooled on that there were visible, non-visible, and you know, like I was coming in it a little cold on it. But when we would talk to defining what we were trying to get at, and it's one of those things where like, I know it when I see it kind of thing. They would say, well, you could call it, you know, vision, you know, you wear glasses. That's just, and like, come on.
Right.
No, what we're talking about is I need an accommodation. That was what we were trying to get at, like, how comfortable do people have in being open about whatever they need and about asking for whatever they need. And the upshot was super stressful to have a non-visible one, that there was a lot of like, I don't want you to know about it. I don't want to talk about it. I'm not going to ask about it. And which just, it breaks your heart, you know, like that it shouldn't be that stressful to be your true self at work, but I totally get it.
And that's really important. When you don't have a visible disability, then you have the right to disclose when you feel comfortable doing so. But if you're not comfortable disclosing at work, yet you need accommodations, that puts you in a bit of a sticky situation. And I also want to note that you can want or need an accommodation and not have a disability or not have a
Right.
diagnosed disability, right? And so I think this is why I think accommodations should be available to anybody, regardless of the presence of a disability. But, I've done some research with autistic adults, and I want to have a note on language here. There is two different ways of talking about disability. There's identity first language and person first language. I think most
Mm-hmm.
people by now are familiar with person first language. That's when you say things like person who uses a wheelchair or, person with a vision impairment, things like that.
Right.
I say autistic person because the autistic self advocates that I know in my life and the scholars that I read note that autism is really important to their identity formation, that they value their autism, and so really prefer identity first. So I'm going to use
Interesting.
autistic individual.
Yeah.
But I did some research with autistic adults on employment and higher education. And what I found was that a lot of them are very hesitant to disclose their autism at work for a variety of reasons. One being that once you do that, then everything you do gets attributed to your autism. So it's, well, you did really good on this task. It's probably because he's autistic. Or they really messed this up. It's probably because of the autism, And so
Right.
and then they also encountered a lot of, when they disclosed their autism to coworkers or bosses, responses like, really? Are you sure? You just don't seem like it. My cousin's autistic and he's nothing like you. Or you don't seem anything like Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory.
Right. Sheldon. Only Sheldon. Yeah.
So, and those are just inappropriate
Right.
responses.
Well, yeah. Well, so where is the equation right now? So in the world that I talk to a lot of the folks that are working in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, it's a lot about gender and race, ethnicity. And between us and anyone listening, but disability is always included, but I don't know. It just feels often like a check the box
It
thing.
really does. And I definitely agree with that. And, we do with disruptive inclusion, we do all that other stuff as well. But like I said, we bring a specialty to disability. And one of the reasons is because it seems to be often sort of the tag on at the end.
Yeah.
And it's really focused on the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you can really go much beyond the ADA and accommodations. I think that the reason for this sort of forgottenness is that because disability is associated with our bodies and our minds and our biology, it seems sort of like a natural type of hierarchy that, we can point to a particular thing that makes somebody's skills or abilities different than people that we are typically encountering in the workspace. And because we are so focused on productivity and so focused on, normalcy, then it seems just natural that we would have certain people who have differences in those areas be left out. Like that seems like a reasonable reason not to hire somebody or not to give somebody a tender.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is that all of our definitions of what is normal or typical is culturally situated within history, within, like I said, our culture. And so all of our definitions of disability and what doesn't quote unquote count as normal or is pathologized is also deeply cultural and changes over time, changes over place. I mean, we didn't have the word autism until the 1940s, right? So
Did not even know that. I thought it was a more recent term. There you go.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And so, I think that's the reasons why I think it's kind of like tagged on to the end. The other thing I think is that our culture has used disability labels, particularly disability labels that are associated with the mind, to denigrate other groups. So women couldn't vote for a long time because we were too feeble-minded to understand the complexities of politics.
Sure.
Native American populations were thought too incompetent to own land or even manage their own money. And of course, we know that people who were enslaved were deemed also too incompetent to even care for their own lives and have this paternalistic perspective. All of that is the employment of disability to break down other groups. And so when we try to remove the stigma from those other groups, part of that is saying, well, they're not disabled in this way, right? But that still suggests disability is a bad thing.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I'm thinking of as a child of a certain age, a Jennifer,
Mhm.
born in the 60s, to watch the use of language
Mhm.
around the
Mhm.
LGBTQ community, like that was the way you denigrated people when you were a
Right.
kid, and so because somehow it meant that you were weak,
Mhm.
especially amongst the boys somehow.
Right.
And you're making me think of that kind of like, wait, why does that say weak? Why,
Yep.
what are you talking about? And the same thing of you're crazy,
Mhm.
you're unstable, you're whatever as a way to, yeah,
That's
of,
such a good point. And, we have a campaign that's been going on for a few years called In the R Word, which is
mhm.
to stop using the R word as an insult. Now people use intellectual disability as the scientific classification. But before the R word, there was moron, imbecile, and idiot, which were scientific classifications. So there's this cycle of taking these scientific classifications, they use them as insults, and then having to come up with a new word.
So like you're telling me that the kids of my elementary school, and probably myself included, I will not exclude myself from we were actually being scientists. Great, got
Absolutely,
it.
absolutely. But I'm also really glad that you brought up the word crazy because we use that word all the time colloquially, and it's a
Yeah,
really hard one for people to remove from the vocabulary because at first blush it seems kind of like not a bad word. Like if somebody tells you, "Oh my God, I went to this party last weekend and it was so crazy." You're like, "Oh, that sounds like a party I maybe wanted to be."
yeah,
It sounds kind of great. But when you think about it, what is that word crazy standing in for? It's standing in for wild, unpredictable, kind of, those kinds of words. Those aren't really words you want applied to a person
right, right. And yet we do.
necessarily.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Well, how about that? Like one of the things I remember from doing our study, our very small,
mhm,
dipping our toe into this whole topic was the unemployment rate among,
mhm,
especially folks with visible disability
mhm,
is super high,
mhm,
like unconscionably high, which it just when you're thinking, really? So if someone's needs a cane or is in a wheelchair,
mhm.
they somehow you're not going to, I, what's happening with employment?
It's so bad. It's so bad. And people who have these sort of visible disabilities, it part of it is companies get afraid that they're going to have to spend all kinds of money in
Yes.
accommodations, which accommodations are not the average about $500.
Yeah.
Then, so it's not that much.
It's like a desk, like
Yeah,
I just need a desk that I can go up or higher or lower with.
exactly.
Maybe it's a
Exactly.
keyboard I need. I mean, it's really, yes,
Yeah.
and that fear is palpable. That,
Yeah.
oh my God, that's going to cost me like $10,000 to get that person all
Yeah.
set in, and
So
just
not true. Yeah.
yeah,
And then I think also, I mean, unfortunately, the people I know who have visible disabilities continue to report that often it's assumed that their skills and abilities and intellect are also disabled. And so there's
yeah,
this
somehow
place
lesser
of
than,
disability.
yeah,
But even beyond that, people with disabilities of the mind are the most unemployed. And there's been some really interesting economic studies coming out saying that instead of having people with disabilities in what are called sheltered workshops, which are just basically like adult daycare, as you maybe give people a task and pay them pennies
hmm
on the dollar, that is not for a community as economically profitable than the alternative, which is to have something called a job coach, which is where somebody goes into a job with a person who is disabled and helps them to whatever extent they need. And that might be the job coach is there every single day with that person, but it also might be that that person helps them get started, learn the job, and then just checks in every once in a while. And it's shown that that model is better economically and obviously much better for people with disabilities because they're out in the community, they're actually, participating in our community and they're not hidden away in the way that they are in sheltered workshops.
and then how many people are using executive coaches,
Mm-hmm.
career
Yeah.
coaches, media trainers. You think of all
Right.
there's a whole universe of great, smart people that help
Mm-hmm.
the executive, the top
Mm-hmm.
achieve even more. And like, It's just
love that
basically
analogy.
an executive coach for someone who just needs it in a certain, it's all skill help.
You're right. I love that analogy. I had not thought about that. Do you mind if I
Yeah,
steal that and keep
you
that for the rest
completely do.
of my Thank you.
I am here for it. So, yes, this is just the executive coach for yet another person on your
That's
team.
so
It's just a
true.
different way.
It's
It's executive function. There you go.
100%. Absolutely. Awesome.
Well, tell me, so the word I had mentioned in talking about you
Mhm.
is ableism,
Mhm.
which is a word, those of us who are in the world have
Mhm.
heard it, but I'm not quite sure, like, what is it and how can we be anti-ableist?
Good question. So, ableism is sort of the counterpart of racism, sexism, heterosexism, things like that. It's basically a word of discrimination against people because of their disability. More technically, it's a preference for people who aren't disabled.
Mm.
And this shows up all over in our world. Once you start looking for ableism, you'll never be able to stop looking
Oh, no.
for
It's like,
ableism.
much like sexism and racism. Got it.
Exactly, exactly. And it's instituted in our policies. For example, again, when we come to employment, we still have Section 14C of the Labor Standard Act, which allows companies to apply to pay their disabled workers below minimum wage.
Really?
Under this notion that they're not going to be as productive as their other employees. So that is a very clear example of ableism. But then there's also, language that we've already talked about as kind of some more implicit ableism. Talking to people with disabilities in a different tone of voice is ableism. And it's just kind of everywhere. Using non-disabled actors and actresses to play disabled characters in the media
Hmm.
is, things like that. And so, just like racism and sexism, we're all enculturated to be ableist, right?
Yeah.
There's this amazing Black philosopher at Emory named George Yancey, and he talks about how, as a white person, which he is not, obviously, then you are racist. And the best you can be is an anti racist racist. And he says, just like as a man, he is sexist, and the best he can be is an anti sexist sexist. And so I think that really makes a lot of sense. It tells us that nobody escapes the
Right.
enculturation of discrimination. And so I think the best we can be is an anti ableist. And just, similar to being an ally with other communities, it starts with informing yourself, right? This does not mean go find your disabled friend or coworker and do an interview. This means go to the internet, which has a wealth of resources. I actually have on my website, disruptiveinclusion.com, a resources tab that has a whole bunch of resources created by people with disabilities. So it's a good start. So I think, again, starting out by just informing yourself to be an ally. And the next thing is, you can, even though if you do not identify as disabled, you can still keep an eye out for access barriers in your company and in your life. So noting if, for example, there are stairs to a building and there's no ramp, or the ramp is around the back of the building rather than sort of integrated into the front of the building. That's something that even if you do not use a wheelchair, you can make noise about. I think that being open about leaders in particular, I think one of my top suggestions for leaders to get started to be anti-ableist is at the beginning of meetings or get-togethers or anything like that, to note the access features and the limitations of those features. So, for example, if we ever go back to a place when we have in-person meetings,
What?
leaders can be like, okay, welcome to our meeting. We have microphones because it amplifies voices for people with hearing impairments. So I hope that everybody will use a microphone, even though this is a kind of a smallish space. Unfortunately, we do not have live captioning. Just noting those kinds of features is a really good way to be an ally.
Yeah. I always love the idea that you have to be ever vigilant.
Mhm.
You have to continue to grow.
Mhm.
A friend of our podcast, Christina Blacken says, just because you're, a good person, you don't get a pass.
Right.
she,
Right.
it's like, this isn't a theme park and you don't get a pass when it comes to institutional racism and,
Absolutely.
institutional ableism. And it's just because, we're blessed by the things we don't even think about
Mhm.
that go our way because we don't need the microphone or to amplify. We don't need, the ramp to go up.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that my kid is probably running up and down that ramp.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the thing is things like a lot of these accommodations, like ramps or microphones or whatever the case may be, are useful for people without disabilities too. And that's what's called
Yes.
universal design. So if you don't know about universal design, I highly recommend that all the listeners go and check out universal design. It's a way to think about developing and creating spaces that are as accessible to as many people as possible, which then reduces the likelihood that somebody is going to need to out themselves and ask for an accommodation. But like ramps and curb cuts, great for people with strollers.
I love them.
I do too. It's
Great
like,
for people whose knees are aching a
yes,
bit.
exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. It's so true.
It is very true that in the working mother world, we always would say we were at the vanguard 'cause all the things that we wanted, like paid sick time,
Yeah.
flexible work, these things everyone in the workforce wanted. It's just we always desperately needed them the minute we have a kid. And we're like, oh my God, I
Yeah.
need some paid time. And it's the same way, like with universal design.
Mhm.
These are things we all want. It's just the person desperately needs it is up front,
Mhm.
saying, no, I need this right now.
Yeah, that's
So
so true.
please.
And I love captioning. I mean, like, come
Yeah.
on.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. If you're watching The Crown, I can't understand
Right?
anything Prince Philip says. He doesn't move his lips. And I'm sure that's how the real guy does it. But caption, thank you.
Right, right.
So thank you for universal design of closed captioning. I appreciate
Well,
it.
and I'll put a plug in here for clear masks. Since we're all wearing masks these days, it means that people who
Ooh.
have hearing impairments can't read lips as easily, which isn't the best solution, right? The best solution obviously is more people to learn American Sign Language.
Mm.
But even with American Sign Language, facial expressions are really important part of
Yeah.
communicating. So we have some clear masks here in this household, and I recommend people check them out.
Wow. I've seen some. And it's funny how you see things too that you don't realize, like what their original. It's like you
Mhm.
see it and you think, "Oh, that's kind of cool. That's really great." And
Right,
not thinking, "Well, there's a reason
right.
that they started and then we all benefit."
Exactly. That's exactly right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, can we spend a little time on so you're a non-disabled
Mhm.
ally.
Mhm.
So what brought you to this field?
Yeah. So I first got interested in autism. I'm gonna go way back. I first got interested in autism in high school, in my high school AP Psych class, and kind of decided that I really wanted to learn more and started doing my own study on it. And in college, I studied psychology and I became the head teacher for a young woman who was autistic in her home. And then I went on and got a special education degree, master's degree at Vanderbilt, and was doing some special education work. And never, it was fine, but there was something about it that didn't quite mesh well with me. So I did some traveling and decided I really just wanted to travel the world and hang out with autistic people. And so I ended up going to Emory and getting my PhD, where I studied culture and autism. And it was at Emory that I encountered the field of disability studies, which is kind of like women's studies or African American studies. It's the study of disability culture and history and rights and
Mm.
advocacy. And that's when I kind of realized, oh, this is why I was uncomfortable with special education, because it was normalizing disability. It was trying to make people with disabilities act non-disabled in a way that made me uncomfortable at my
Oh.
core. And so that's what opened up this world of ableism, of disability culture and history, and disability rights and advocacy. And so I started to really shift all of my work into that direction. Along the way, I started learning about ethics and bioethics and human rights, and all of that is integrated into my approach as well. And I teach all of this stuff in my classes. And then I kept thinking, God, I just really want to be out there in the community doing more impactful on the ground work, which brought me to diversity, equity, and inclusion type of work. So
Yeah.
that's where I am at now. And I love it. I get really worked up and passionate. I think my most common feedback on trainings, workshops, and classes is Dr. Sarrett really is very passionate. So my enthusiasm is sometimes I think a little bit on the higher end.
Yeah, I know. I can get that way too. So I always have to say I'm now stepping down from my soapbox. I'm out. Sorry.
Yeah, I hear that. But
Well,
I
and
think
so
it's
what are the
important.
companies saying? What are the types of things you're doing in the company? And wrap up your entire business in a minute. There you go.
Yeah.
Sorry
So,
about that.
the conclusion, in terms of disability and stuff like that, it's really you start at where people are. I
Mhm.
think that people
Yeah,
think about doing disability DE&I and think, oh God, one more thing. How am I going to mess
right,
this up? And so, we can start where people are at with what are your accommodation needs, how to put them most appropriately, things like that, all the way up to how to really incorporate anti-ableism, allyship, and work throughout the organization. We
hmm
also, though, focus on teaching and training the foundations of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, like intersectionality, microaggressions, othering, which is important not only to disability, but to all other
right,
disenfranchised identity groups. The idea is that, if we can teach leaders and teams the why of DE&I, then they can go on to do the how in ways that are sustainable, dynamic, and more appropriate for their teams without
right,
necessarily the need for constant consultation, right?
right. Yeah, I could see that because sometimes you may be coming to a company that this whole consideration of DEI is brand new. Others where they have a history of doing it, they just kind of have never really watered the garden that had the
Exactly.
disability, equation as part of it. So,
Exactly. And we really do a custom built approach. I have a background in anthropology. And so, I love doing anthropological qualitative research. So I do that to specify specific needs. And then I have a team of subject area experts I can pull on for, if you don't want the ally perspective, but I think that the disability perspective is most appropriate, then I can, reach out to one of my disability self advocates or
mhm.
people who are experts and from the field of race or gender or sexuality to sort of lead actual trainings and workshops or strategy or whatever.
Right. Oh, well, thank you. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for joining us on the Breadwinners
Thank you
today.
so much for having me. It was lovely.
Our guest today was Dr. Jennifer Sarrett. You'll find links to what diversity conversation, the topics that we're talking about her group in the episode description. Email us anytime at thebreadwinnerspod@gmail.com or visit us at thebreadwinnerspodcast.com. Remember to subscribe to our podcast and to rate and review it. It really helps us grow. And until next week, keep hustling.
This podcast is part of the Sound Advice FM network. Sound Advice FM, women's voices amplified.